we can. We admit in today's debate that it's not always the case that the American dream is factually true in America, in the United States of America. But nevertheless, the notion of having a prominent American dream that we can actually rise above that is an important good. We on opening government is going to take on the burden that the American dream is not only good when it's true, but also when it's false because of a couple of reasons. Three things in opening government. First, we're going to clarify the model in three ways. Secondly, and then provide two arguments about how it's a powerful national framework, and also secondly, how it yields better political outcomes. First, on the model. We recognize this is first a normative debate asking a question of whether this is good, this existing national discourse is good for America. Secondly, what we specifically support are things like referencing the American dream in the political sphere, expounding upon the idea and redefining it in subtle ways, and that as we see in prominent in our political sphere. Thirdly, we want to note that this debate is not about when the American dream itself is weak, but rather when it's a prominent force, and therefore all the harms that they talk about, about how this is a weak form and this doesn't exist, is actually not the scope of this debate. First argument, why is a powerful national framework? First, we have to recognize that nations always have a zeitgeist. Nations always have a national norm. We believe that sometimes it is the case that there are prominent norms, but if that's not the case, it is more the case that there's always competing norms, for example, in subgroups. Regardless whether it's strong or weak, always a national framework that unifies people will exist. So therefore, the comparative, for example, in the case of France, advancing its notion of strong culture, Israel advancing its notion about how they're in a special place, we always believe that there's this key framework. Therefore, the comparative in this debate is which kind of powerful framework we're going to advance, and we're going to argue that this American dream was successful because it says any American succeed is the superior one. And we think that it's comparative, and instead will rise as things like the Christian framework in America, which is inherently exclusive towards a particular sect and a part of its population, and we don't think it's good. So why does this specific notion of the American good particularly make sense in the American context? I'm going to give you three ways. First, I'm going to talk about how it actually advances the notion of agency. It advances the notion that you have control over your destiny, and therefore maximizes individual American citizens as agents who can make things possible for their lives and lead to the necessary belief of upward mobility in our society. We think this is fundamentally important in many cases. Secondly, we want to talk about how this leads to, many times, a zeitgeist in cultural sense. For example, more investment happening, American citizens being willing to invest in education for their children, or having the courage to start new businesses. Recognize, Madam Speaker, that what led to America's economic success many times things like the Silicon Valley, in which entrepreneurs with the American spirit were courageous enough to start up on bold, innovative moves that actually put them in a superior place in the world's economic market sphere. We think that's absolutely important in the sense that it provides a national framework that allows every economic participant to take on the infrastructure that exists, the creative commons that exists in the American country, and see that they can capitalize on those notions, and we think that's fundamentally good. Thirdly, we believe that this is actually a very good unifying framework. Because recognize, Mr. Speaker, that this allows essential sacrifices that many Americans make. Recognize, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, sorry, that America has the highest private per capita rate of charitable giving. In the sense that when the tsunami hit Indonesia, what happened wasn't that the biggest donor was, for example, the Indonesian government, the Singaporean government, but was actually American citizens, private American citizens, that are actually willing to step into space and say, you know what, these people are suffering, and we think that for their sense of agency, we need to step into. We think this is not only true in the international level, but also in the national level. For example, when Hurricane Katrina hit, it wasn't the sense that the actual state governments walking in, but many times private individual actors saying that their American dreams were crushed by something that they did not have control over, and in order to maximize their controlled agency, we were willing to step in and provide a stepping stone for them to rise high. Second argument, how does this lead to better political outcomes? Because recognize, Madam Speaker, that this debate is about when the American dream doesn't make sense and doesn't actually hold true in the individualistic level. We recognize perfectly fine that sometimes not all people are successful economically, not all people want the education that they currently have. But recognize, Madam Speaker, that's also a fact for any kind of society. It is a regrettable fact in life that you don't succeed as much as you can. We believe that in that particular framework, the American dream doesn't work. There are real political outcomes that make for that, and that's absolutely important. So I want to give you one.
Yeah, so you said that the American dream helps stimulate innovation in places like Silicon Valley, but innovation doesn't seem to be something unique to America. Why then is it the American dream specifically that leads to these kinds of projects?
I don't see something innovation as massive as the Silicon Valley happening in any other country, but even if that were true, we believe that any kind of economic stimulation in other countries were probably beneficial in a counterfactual with a prominent national zeitgeist, their version of the American dream existing in that case, we believe that it's necessary for that to happen, especially the belief that you can capitalize on the vast resources that exist in this country is a notion that was uniquely advantageous for American business owners. So, three ways that how this leads to better political outcomes. Number one, how it targets the deficiencies. Recognize, Madam Speaker, that we have something called the political system, and it's also a self-correcting one with the American dream. Why is this the case? Because many times the political elites or the economic elites who actually make the vast majority up in the Congress have at least two reasons to take care about the deficiencies and the failures of the American dream. Number one, in the case of legitimacy, because it's more legitimate as a politician to come up here and say, I'm a self-made man, rather than I was born with the wealth that my father gave, but rather that the channels and the ladder that actually made me rise up to this level is also available to other people. It is the political legitimacy that only exists on our side of the house. But also secondly, believe that understanding that this is our national goal and a very convenient political rhetoric to mobilize their constituents to follow their necessary political support for these politicians who carry out these real policies work in this case. But also secondly, when the political system doesn't actually correct for the problems that exist in the status quo, there are private factors jumping in. For example, if you read the news today, in the Ramada Hotel, there was food banks in New York City actually trying to make up for the deficiency of the New York State government not able to provide food in the poor, low-income families in the New York City. Secondly, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in which there are private actors trying to step in the state failure to provide adequate resources. We think all of this is necessary, is important in our case, because even when the political system doesn't actually work towards, private sectors who believe in this American dream actually step in the case. Thirdly, we like to talk about what's called political outcomes and political incentives. Obamacare only happened in our side of this house because Barack Obama was able to campaign on the idea that the American dream is broken. But actually, that we can still do this. We can make sure that we allow basic minimum standards for agents to capitalize upon, to have basic help to actually achieve the dreams that they can on the arbitrary obstacles that block them from doing so is something that we as a nation has to get rid of, because getting rid of that barrier is beneficial for everybody in the United States of America. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud of the post.
I thank the member for their address, and I invite the leader of the opposition.
I think the fact that the Prime Minister concludes his speech by saying that Barack Obama was only able to implement Obamacare, which helps stem social inequality in the United States, by campaigning on the idea that the American dream was broken, is a problem for Gov's side and the main thrust of the op case. When you have an opiate for the masses of the American dream that states that social mobility is equally available to all demographics in the face of patent racism, sexism, and homophobia in the United States, you create a barrier to gaining social change and prejudice individuals who feel as though they have failed and not the system. We are proud to oppose. My first point is that the American dream is dead and false. The motion said that based on your demographics, you can advance no matter what. So I don't concede that it's not real. I'm going to impact this for you. Women get paid significantly less for equal work. Women who graduate with better grades than men receive worse compensation and worse opportunities. People who have sexual minority views are way disproportionately not represented in leadership roles. If you are, say, a black or a visible minority individual in the United States, then you cannot advance in the same way that your neighbor who doesn't have these sort of demographic features can. This is a problem. Why? Because we don't have the discussions on social mobility and racism in society when people are bred and taught that no matter who you are, you can achieve anything. This discourse shapes the political culture of America. Things that people believe change what politicians are able to say acceptably in the political forum. This means now that when a politician, or say a Democrat, tries to raise the issue of social inequality, they have to combat the ingrained beliefs of Americans writ large that the American dream states that anyone can do this, right? Now when someone gets up and say there is a problem with America, the easy response, which has been taught to children from a young age, is no, the American dream exists, they just have to work harder. This is a problem. Why? Because this harms the welfare state and welfare discourse in America. You get less empathy for the poor from middle-class individuals who which support for social programs is critically important to gain any sort of political change. Why do they have this empathy? Because they've been taught that all you have to do to escape from poverty is to work hard. They believe that anyone can overcome any barriers, and instead of looking at the social inequalities and the racism and sexism that prevents members of minority groups to escape the cycle of poverty, they put the onus on the individual to succeed. They don't need to be helped. All they need to do is work harder. What are the concrete impacts of this? Is that you get less support for things like Obamacare, which needed the bump of the American dream is dead to exist. You get less support for welfare funding, and you just get a greater sense of social disconnect between the classes, which leads to a less cohesive society. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, I reject on this there are not private discussions and national attention towards issues of racism, sexism, and things like that. And what I don't think in the American dream is you can always overcome these things. This is the way that America should be.
Okay, that's not true. That's not the motion. The American dream says anybody can do anything. That's something we all have to accept here. And there are discussions, but let's have a comparative look at the world. Would these discussions be more fruitful and fall more on the side of attacking structural inequalities in America if people were not ingrained with the idea that these structural inequalities do not meaningfully prevent mass majorities of the population from escaping poverty? Our side, on side off, very logical and justified side, is that these discussions get better social outcomes for welfare states on our side of the house. Our second point is that this is extremely harmful to individuals because you tell them that it is your fault that you cannot escape poverty. Why is this harmful? Because when an entrepreneur tries to start a business, or when someone tries to start their career, and they fail because of things like discrimination, because of things like structural inequality, because of things like other people having a greater concentration of wealth in their half of the world, we think they blame themselves and feel disenfranchised. Why is this problematic? One, because when you tell people that all you have to do to succeed in life is to work hard, and they work hard and they feel as though they have no self-worth. This is morally oppressive to people, and we would rather they have the justification and have society on their side saying it is not your fault that you are here, it is not your fault that you cannot escape the cycle of poverty, something is wrong with America, and let's endeavor to fix it. We think the rhetoric which we promote, which is let's endeavor to fix America, is much more comforting to these people and much more likely to get them to actually work hard and take themselves out of poverty. We think that you feel like you just have failed and it is all your fault, then you don't do things like take ambitious opportunities because you don't feel like you are worthy, you don't feel like you can do it yourself. Okay? Now I'm going to put you into direct recommendations. The first point is that a national framework will always exist in countries. Okay, one, we don't think there has to be like a United States stands for this one thing, rah rah. I think a lot of countries don't have a zeitgeist, and that's fine. But secondly, if there is a zeitgeist, we would rather it be an honest one and one which looks at issues in society and has a fair and reasoned debate about them, right? We would rather it be, let's have America be more egalitarian instead of saying the American dream exists, which is clearly false. So the fact that there is a national monument, or a national rhetoric, doesn't mean that it has to be one that lies to people, causes emotional harms to people, and stems welfare progress in politics. Secondly, this promotes the idea of agency. This promotes the idea that anybody can do anything. We think that the problem is that this is not necessarily true, and that it is very difficult for individuals to actually overcome large social forces. And the harms that happen when you tell people that they can overcome hurdles that they physically cannot, or cannot socially, is that they blame themselves and you get emotional harms and feeling that you're not worthy, that it is your fault. And you get disconnects between the middle class that I talked about earlier. Next point, this inspires innovators to start a business. Okay, Vina nails this when he says other countries have innovation. The response that we get is actually other countries don't innovate. Okay, let me list a few. Korean smartphone manufacturers are very innovative. Samsung, very innovative. The German auto industry, very innovative. Other countries have industries and innovate. We don't think that the benefits that they talk about here on you can start a business are because of the American dream. Furthermore, if the rhetoric were, you can succeed, but for those of you that cannot, let's fix social problems, we think that you get more people succeeding, right? We can still have a rhetoric that says you should start a business, right? It just doesn't have to be one that anyone can start a business and is equally easy for everyone. Okay, their next point is that it is a unifying rhetoric and causes individuals to donate to victims of natural disasters. Literally no link to the American dream whatsoever. We're fine with having a rhetoric that says humans are humans and you should help them. We're fine with having a rhetoric that says Americans are Americans and you should help your people. We're totally fine with that. Nowhere in this donation or sense of unification is there the premise that demographics do not limit you from succeeding in society. I think nothing there. Okay, and last, you get better political outcomes because they say politicians show that they came from modest roots and know anybody can do it. This is exactly the problem. Politicians do not come from modest roots. When George Bush gets up there and says, back in Texas when I was working on the ranch and now I'm president, people from a different background think that they can do it, but they don't the wrong society, that's precisely the problem. We are very proud of you folks.
Side opposition fails to understand what happens when claims that are both normative and descriptive are not, strictly speaking, true in all cases. I want to use an analogy of another case to illustrate this point. Because the only ideology that America has had is not just this notion of the American dream, but other facets. Let's talk about one of those, which is the notion that America is a bastion of democracy, that all individuals have equal political access and have the ability to self-determine. What was a problem about this notion that was propounded and expounded and still is? It was not, strictly speaking, true. Women were denied suffrage. Black individuals and those of other races were denied suffrage and were in fact enslaved. The tension between the falsity of the descriptive claim and the fact that it was both descriptively and normatively purported and instilled in Americans created a tension that eventually forced a movement in the political and private sphere towards the elimination of that discrepancy. The same thing is always true of the American dream. Yes, not literally everyone can always improve their quality of life. And yes, not everyone can improve their quality of life as much as we would like. But the tension between that fact and the fact that we descriptively and normatively endorse this statement creates the pressure and changes behavior in helpful ways. So I'm going to separate this debate out into 3 questions. I'm going to talk about how the psychology is instilled in Americans and how that changes people's behavior. I'm going to talk about the use of the American dream as a political yardstick, and I'm going to talk about alternate narratives. A bit of rebuttal is going to be interwoven, but I want to do 2 explicit bits first. The first is the notion of the impact of the fact that this has been false, because it creates a problem with, it creates the notion that there is never a problem with America. For 2 reasons. First is the one I already gave you, but second is the comparative. Because in the absence of this narrative of the American dream, alternate narratives prevail. We say that these are going to be primarily subgroup-based, as in Christian ideology, or naturalistic fallacies, that things are the way they are, that they could not be otherwise. The problem with that is it reifies the status quo and leaves it immoral to change, because instead of poor people could succeed, what's the problem with them not succeeding in the status quo? It's no, they could never succeed, they don't have the talents, they don't have the abilities. The comparative that exists on their side of the house is therefore a problem. Secondly, the notion that it's harmful to individuals psychologically because individuals believe they have no worth if they fail. No, what they believe is they can succeed, not that they will succeed each and every time that they try. So it forces individuals to try and try again. Now it's true, they won't always succeed. But what's important on our side of the house is that, again, the comparative is better. Because an ideology that incentivizes individuals to continue striving is strictly better than the alternative. Because the fact that human beings are physically limited, the fact that not everything within society leaves you with complete freedom, but other is not to say that individuals have no agency. And to the extent that we can instill in individuals the notion that that agency is promoted and inspire them to the notion that they can strive, there is more of it, and that is strictly preferable. So, how is the psychology preferable on our side of the house? Because that notion of agency, we say, is crucial to lots of impacts. It leads people to keep going back to get a college degree, even while they're facing difficulty in working multiple jobs. We say that sort of individual instillment is crucially important. They say, and I'll take you in a second, that in terms of the economics, there are other nations that innovate, and the striving within the economics is not unique. But actually, America has the largest proportion of small businesses in the world by a massive margin, and has driven domestic innovation to be higher continually decade after decade than any other Western nation. Yes?
Can you explain to me why a rhetoric that ignores the disenfranchising effect of demographics on your ability to advance is worse or is better than one that allows us to fix the problem and still encourage?
I'm going to get that because we are. I want to finish this up. So yes, there is innovation in developing nations. Presumably, the higher rates of innovation and growth within those nations because they started at a lower level. The proper comparatives compare against other Western nations, and the disproportionate number of individuals who take entrepreneurial chances in the United States is a good reason to believe that there is a cultural difference that actually does lead to more innovation. That Silicon Valley could not have happened in Denver. So, finally, the unifying framework that leads to charitable giving. They claim that they gave no link here, but this is the crucial fact. When natural factors intervene and intercede with the ability to self-determine and improve one's quality of life, other individuals view this as a violation of the way things ought to be and the way things would have been in the absence of things like Hurricane Katrina and move it to fill that gap. The charitable giving thus acts as is a crucial way in which we ameliorate the random and the vicissitudes of the natural order. Second, it's used as a political yardstick. Note that, yeah, Obamacare could only get passed because of the additional record of the American dream to get over the line. Exactly, guys. This is the benefit we get on our side of the house. Because we can always point to a particular deficiency in the American dream and say, like, this is the one thing we need to fix. This is what's holding people back. The lack of healthcare keeps a certain class of people from accessing the American dream. And fix and target that problem. How do we know that this is an important narrative in comparison to narratives that they would have? Because we've seen it be politically effective. Because individuals feel that it resonates. And it leads them to support the sorts of political leaders that seek to address this. The yardstick is we never fully achieve the American dream, but it is always politically popular to move closer. So they say things like, the notion of legitimacy we talk about with politicians is a problem because these politicians actually don't rise to prominence. But they miss the point of this argument. The fact that they have to campaign on this notion constrains their political action once in office, because they can't take actions that will be perceived as pulling out the ladder underneath them, which constrains the sorts of political action and it leads to things like more resistance against welfare cuts that they have more of on our side of the house. So, also note that it really doesn't talk about, they didn't address our notion about the private sector jumping in and the state fails, and how that's necessary to stabilize the research constraint. But what's the paradox, the third thing we want to talk about? Because the alternate narratives will be strictly worse. There is always social norms, we told you. There's always a notion of a zeitgeist or particular that any society will identify with. We say alternatives can only be of one of two types. Either they are subgroups, in which case they are exclusionary and inherently worse, or they are naturalistic, that things can't be otherwise, that rich people are just better, more able to succeed. Both are strictly worse, and it's what they have to refer to. So when they tell us, like, we don't need to have a national discourse, no, it's to revert to the alternate discourses that already exist in society. The prominence of the American dream prevents those narratives from becoming dominant. If you want egalitarian outcomes, you have to have a notion that will lead to egalitarian outcomes, that will both on the individual level lead individuals to take actions that will result in betterment in their own life circumstance, and on the macro, social, and political level, create incentives and create constraints on those that would otherwise be elites. Because the comparative question of this debate is, how do you engender that empathy among the elite when the elite have fully internalized the notion that every individual ought to have the ability and can have the ability to succeed? When that's not true, they must face that reality and change that reality. We are proud to be opposed.
Thanks for their address, and I invite the deputy leader of the opposition board to close out the time.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Me and Joe think it is incredibly damaging when America is viewed by American citizens as not a country that has rich people and poor people, but rather a country that has millionaires and soon-to-be millionaires. We think that rhetoric is incredibly destructive to the kinds of policies that the American government is able to pass. We think Joe's told you a lot of things. I've told you a few more about them in constructive and refute everything we're coming out of the opening government. Here's a great example of a policy which is precluded by the kind of American dream we're talking about. A simple policy like inheritance tax ought to be a policy that most reasonable countries and most reasonable discussions will get popular support for. Why is this? Simply put, the overwhelming majority of people in America or any country will never own an estate that actually fall under an inheritance tax. The problem is any time this issue is raised in American discourse, or the discussion of raising the inheritance tax perhaps is discussed, people don't buy into it. And they don't buy into it because they think that someday in the future they will be the owner of that massive estate, even though empirically speaking the chances of that are incredibly small. I think that is an example of the kind of policy me and Joe have talked about. General welfare spending, the kind of tax we're talking about that would make the lives of actual Americans far better. That doesn't happen. Second, I want to talk about the effect that the American dream has on a general notion of American exceptionalism. I think American exceptionalism and the feeling that people in America have that this country is incredibly unique causes Americans to have a slight problem, which is they tend to be divorced from the empirical reality of every other country in the world around them. I think the American dream is a key contributing factor to this narrative. It's not the only one, but it's a key one. This is what it leads to. Because the kind of overtone of the American dream is Americans, when they work really hard in this country, will get ahead. But the implication is like in all those other countries, I don't know about that. I'm not sure. Here's the problem with this. When this kind literally every other country does not do what you do and they do fine. I think that is just not as persuasive as an argument. I think it should be. I think Americans should be open to empirical facts. And I think that when the policy is passed. Number of points from their side. The first thing they tell us on their side of the house is a lot of discussion about what the comparative in this round is. And they're trying to force us into defending, in our world, we have to defend like a very pro-Christian America, or some other kind of narrative that isn't useful. Why can't the actual comparative in this round be that in a world where the American dream did not exist, America would have a political discourse on social mobility, more like most other countries in the world, that is just far more reasonable about the prospects of people working hard and advancing. That's, I think, a far more reasonable comparison in this round for what we actually have to defend on our side of the house. Especially since politicians often perpetuate this kind of rhetoric, we would prefer they perpetuated a more honest and equitable one. No, thank you. That's what I think the comparison in this round actually is. We then hear a point about what the American dream can actually do. And this is, I think, hinted at by closing government, also talked about by government. That it is an ideal to strive for. In the same way that we had democracy as an ideal that eventually led to the ending of voting segregation, this ideal perhaps can someday lead us to a better place. But it can't. Because the American dream, by its very nature, precludes the policy that would be needed for its realization. If we actually want an America that remotely resembles the things that politicians talk about and wax eloquently about, it would require the passage of policies that have had their political support cut out from under them by virtue of the kind of political incentives that the American dream creates. That's what me and Joe stand for in terms of it serving as an ideal. The other thing that I want to address from the DPN speech is his defense of the Obamacare line. He was like, look, when Obama stood up and said the American dream had failed, first, I don't think it was even that extreme, but let's suppose it was. Let's suppose he actually stood up and said the American dream has failed. They're like, that's good, because that involves the American dream. Well, the problem is that I just prefer it never existed, and we would have healthcare like 60 years earlier, presumably. Why is this construct so useful if the most utility that comes out of it is people trashing it in political campaigns? No, thank you. That's actually that persuasive. No, thank you. Then we hear about the idea that this incentivizes charitable giving. A number of problems with this. First, I still don't see the causal link between the American dream and charitable giving, especially with the tsunami that is like not even in America. I'm not sure what that has anything to do with it. But second, more realistically speaking, I think the high rates of charitable giving we see in parts of this country are more religiously motivated because of the power and influence of institutions like the Catholic Church. I don't think it actually has much to do with the American dream itself. We then get an accusation of Joe not responding to a particular argument I like very much. It was the idea that, but private actors can step in when the state fails. So the interesting thing about this argument right off the top of the PN speech is, it's like predicated on the fact that they realize the state often fails in America to provide public goods that lots of people need. Me and Joe's analysis builds on this by showing you that that can be linked to the American dream and the acceptability of particular political discourse about welfare when people don't empathize with the poor in the same way. No, thank you. The link that's never responded to in Joe's speech is actually really important. In almost any other Western liberal democracy, we see socially progressive policies passed by virtue of an alliance between the middle and lower class. The problem is the American dream splinters that alliance between two groups whose interests should be aligned because the middle class doesn't sympathize with the views that the lower class have because they are seen as responsible for their own fate. But also, I recognize that lots of people in this room may have like more ambivalent views on welfare and whether or not it's good. Me and Joe are bleeding-heart Canadians, we like welfare. But even if you don't, surely it would be a more reasoned debate about welfare where one side couldn't appeal to reductionist arguments about why welfare is bad. That would be a far more productive discourse about the acceptable role of the state in the lives of people were that to happen. We then hear about individual agency. Actually, everywhere.
Okay, so which one is more empowering to individuals in adverse circumstances? Them internalizing the fact that they have power themselves or that their adverse circumstances are caused by systemic harm.
Yeah.
No control.
Perfect. That's the very next one I was going to talk about. Individual agency, people feeling very nice. First, it is more useful that they recognize that there are systemic problems if that causes them to be more accepting of politicians who point out and want to fix those systemic problems. Second, and most importantly, I think to a degree even the rhetoric from like the two American teams on Prop is very telling. And they're like, look, clearly Americans feel very empowered with the American dream, but I think people in Britain and Canada also are not like depressed because they don't have an ideology like the American dream. A general notion of rights, a general notion of freedom can achieve a lot of the good things they want without us needing to have this particular kind of social construct. We then hear the argument, I think Joe's dealt with the last two arguments actually from Prop. The innovation argument, I think that like absolutely half of other countries, where America is good at it, may be a function of winning 2 world wars and a massive head start and all kinds of other reasons not linked to the American dream. The other thing that we have to address is the argument of politicians telling people that, look, I came from humble means, therefore you can too. I think we've told you things about political discourse in general, which means that even if this is true, it's not a massive benefit. But often, actually lying to you when they say that I came from me. Politicians stand up and start exaggerating parts of their, like Hillary Clinton did this too, not just Bush, but they're saying that we came from lost means, etc. That is not good for people to hear. That is not good when they recognize that the political class in their country does often come from a select group of people. If we want people to change things that are wrong with this country, the American dream is something that should not have existed. We are very proud to oppose it. America isn't like other countries. I love Canada. I love Europe. They do not have the American dream, and this has led to a profound amount of social disillusion and a history of fundamentally not accepting multiculturalism in the way that America has. Remember, the American, hold on, maybe not with Canada, but certainly. Multiculturalism has failed. They have banned the minarets in Denmark. The UK and the French have a tremendous amount of violence between Muslims and immigrants. The American dream was spawned when it was inscribed on the Statue of Liberty that one of the premises of America was that if you are a hard worker, we have a place for you here. I think any immigration policy that we have here that still remains in America, despite any move from isolation, is a profound effect of the conservative influence that that ideal has been allowed to persist because it is part of the ethos of America that has demanded inclusion for those for the rest of the world when many other people have shut down their borders, when many other people have said that we do not have a place for you. The fact is that it is very easy to unite the lower class and the middle class when they're all from the same ethnic group. It's very easy to have a massive social safety net when you don't have to be giving it to people you don't necessarily value. The premise of America is that you will value anyone if they're willing to pull themselves up. That we have a broad-based society with far more people than these other Western liberal democracies, but we have still allowed for social safety nets for them, even when we could choose to not care about them. Why do we think that is? Because we have an ideal that values their personhood, but additionally it is an ideal that has a broad-based appeal outside of political ideology that many people buy into, and for that reason we believe it is ultimately a force for good. So, a little bit of rebuttal to Vino and Joe. So fundamentally I think they say that it's okay for the masses on their side of the house. So first of all, if all we do is just motivate people who in the alternative would be unmotivated and decide that their class is static, we think that's better at the point that class just literally isn't static for everyone, right? As in, there are people who do achieve and are able to get out of it. Just because not everyone can, doesn't mean that even if 15% are, we're still giving them a vision of something that can happen and normalizing it. But additionally, having the discursive ideal doesn't mean we all concede that it is true, right? Look, even though the info slide says the American dream is a certain premise, we're defending the motion of it is a continual destruction of that premise within the society good. Which means that all of their arguments about how this just begs the question and people will outcast you aren't actually good arguments. But furthermore, arguments about how the lower class will always be in their position predate the American dream, guys. It's called feudalism, right? Like the serfs are serfs by their very nature. The ruling class was given their ruling classness by God because God loves them, and therefore there's no need for class consciousness. If anything, the American dream demands awareness of class consciousness because it always asks, is mobility possible? Which means you have to think about class as something permeable, as something with an opportunity for change, rather than something forever historically entrenched, which is something that hundreds of years political philosophers just insisted in the same way they thought women were bad philosophers because they have ovaries. Ridiculous. All right, so what are we going to tell you on side government? So fundamentally, I think that there's a profound amount of disanalogy coming from Vino, and even though he can play to the crowd because he's an awesome speaker, I don't think he's sufficiently done the work to distinguish America as a test case, and I think all the arguments I've just been giving you prove that. So, why do we support the prominence of the American dream in the national discourse? First of all, we think the national point of inspiration demands class consciousness. Additionally, though, the entire premise of a dream that is not based on ideology,
that is not based on identity, in fact, is an ideal divorced from identity, merely brought into act, as in what you do defines you rather than who you are, is tremendously important. I'm going to make the political argument they ran out of time trying to make, right? Which is that this is a political evaluation that people can make when they are in the middle, right? As in, regardless of who you are, this is the vision for America that you have. So what we would actually say is that this is a profoundly complex ideological concept to have every single American thinking about politics with, right? It's class conscious. It's demanding results from your government. It's saying that some amount of social safety net needs to be present when people aren't having the opportunity, because equality of opportunity in capitalism is the #1 moral metric that we hold our society to. The fact that so many Americans can understand such a complex critique of their society and hold that, and so many independents use this as their yardstick for evaluating politics, means we actually have a means of breaking out of what otherwise in America would be a simple bipolar, like, horse trading and just divvying out of favors. Because there is a group in the middle that doesn't care about any issues other than, does our capitalist society give people access to equal opportunity? We're incredibly happy to defend that on our side of the house. Additionally, though, we'd like to just talk about what this means for the individual. Because the push for education and the push for drive and a vision that your society has enforced to you, that you have an opportunity, we think is tremendous at the point that this openness gives people the right to advocate for themselves. And this isn't always an argument you can present to other people. This gives you standing when you state that there is injustice, because you have a normative position to state that has not been fulfilled. As in, when you sue individuals and you say these social services are separate and they are not equal, that demand for equality comes from an American vision of equality for all, regardless of status, regardless of identity, which we don't necessarily see other places in the world. The next thing we'd like to talk about, though, is what are the actual political outcomes which we think are entrenched by having this as an available yardstick. But first, I'll take that back.
The problem is we can still have a doctrine of equality without the American dream when the observable characteristic of success is seen as indicative of the intrinsic underlying value of a human being. That is when you say these people are not deserving of equality because they are poor or because they are
okay, fine. I'm going to beat what the op has been doing in this round for the last 9 minutes speech, right? Yes, there are potential counterfactuals. But we are stating that the one we have is much better than the alternative, right? What's the other vision of capitalism they have on their side, right? Is it a crony capitalism? Is it an oligopoly capitalism? Is it a capitalism that favors certain minorities or certain majorities? Is it a capitalism that is non-inclusive? Because these are the capitalisms we see around the world. I don't think it's in any way acceptable to state that there's an alternate history of America where this actually would have made America worse, at the point that we have proven to you in this speech that this is what demanded that America be inclusive to people around the world. This is the kind of thing that left America open to the fact that the women took up all the jobs in World War II, they performed well, and that was the first breakthrough with Rosie the Riveter in the American consciousness, that when women worked hard, they had a right. And the fact is, we don't have equal pay here, but we don't have equal pay throughout the world, and we still have a lot more property rights for women, and a lot more equality of access for women, and more women being educated, and more women CEOs than so many other potential alternatives if you look at other capitalist democracies that don't have these same provisions. Fundamentally, American idealism is far better than an American realism that accepts its own failure. And for that reason, we're tremendously proud to support those.
Thank you, members of the press, and I get the option of executive speaker forward.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, even if the American dream could be realized, Julie and I still stand against it because it is a philosophy of inequality and exclusivity fundamentally. Not everyone can achieve the American dream because the American dream is about competition. And in that competition, only a few can ever be successful. The American dream is comparative. It is not about everyone being equal. It is about certain people succeeding in a capitalist framework. Up and downside, we get a justification for the capitalist system. Welcome to second op, where we recognize that massive redistribution is probably preferable to that. I'm going to talk not just about the structural characteristics that opening op told you about. I'm going to talk about the fundamental personal worth and personal shame that people who don't succeed within capitalism feel, and how that's inherently tied to the American dream. Because the American dream perpetuates skills are simply more profitable than other skills. You do not choose the skills with which you are born. You do not choose the fact that you might be quite good at math. You can work very hard to become good at something, but I do not think that we exist in a world where people's skills are a representation of their work to the extent that SciGov believes that they are. I think that some people have skills which the market simply does not value under capitalist system. I think that that is bad because the American dream uses economic success as a determinant of moral success, but also as a determinant of success within the system. There are people whose skills fundamentally don't match that. That way they are excluded from the American dream because even though they work exceptionally hard, even though they fulfill their talents to their fullest, they still aren't economically successful, they still don't understand why, and they are stigmatized for that, and that is really, really awful. Okay, so I do think that those people feel a sense of failure. Even if people don't work as hard as SciGov would like them to, I think that that is fine. I think a vision of the good life where you are consistently working and where you are trying to become as economically successful as possible is not a vision of the good life for everyone. Yet the American dream prioritizes that as the only good life. That simply isn't true. Selling your wage labor for 40 hours plus a week, having to retire when you're 70 because you're a blue-collar worker who could not afford to save a lot for your retirement, making that your life is not good for everyone. If the American dream tells you that that's what you have to do, everyone has to participate in the American dream when it is the dominant national discourse about social mobility and about class mobility. So not only is class mobility not possible for all the really important structural reasons that I've told you, but I still think that there isn't something that is accessible to everyone in the way that the American dream asserts that it is. And it's really harmful to that happen.
Okay, so America was founded on a lot in terms of property rights and capitalism. The American dream started the first moment in America where we had class consciousness, and before that, the alternative was probably the kind of capitalism you're voting for.
Okay, so you might get class consciousness with the American dream, but you do not get a real change within the system. I think the American dream justifies capitalism and justifies the success of the rich, and so you don't get massive redistribution because we think of the rich as people who are successful and who deserve their success, and the poor as people who deserve what they got too. But I don't think that that is always the case, and I think it is much harder to have a system of redistribution with the American dream. Okay, sorry, one second. Okay, so, and even if SciGov wants people to still strive and wants people to still be productive, I think that is possible in a framework outside of the American dream. I think that people are motivated to fulfill their talents to the fullest because of the intrinsic satisfaction that they get from doing that. I don't think that people are motivated primarily by economic success when we're talking about the high levels of innovation that SciGov really prioritizes and the very, very exceptional cases. I think Steve Jobs still would have created really great iPhones and all that kind of fun stuff without the American dream. That usually isn't the drive for most very, very successful people. Or those rags to riches stories. Because I think that the American dream places a premium on the exception, not the rule. I think that the rule is that people will work very hard and probably not succeed. The exception is the people who work hard but are also just lucky because the talents that they have are quite profitable, and that is extremely problematic. The American dream generalizes that story as if that is something that is accessible to everyone. It simply is not. It's a combination of luck, and it is a combination of skill and hard work. Okay, so yeah, I don't think that capitalism is that great. But I also think that a problem with the American dream is that it conflates your economic success with your moral worth. So we think on Gov that hard work is something that we should always place a moral premium on. First of all, I question whether or not that is the case. I think that there are many other parts of an individual's life that are equally deserving of attention and that are equally worthwhile as hard work. But I think that the American dream prioritizes work and prioritizes the economic outcome of that work as a marker of success. We see a fetishization of the rich. We place the rich on a pedestal thinking that they are often morally superior because they worked hard for their position. So I told you that sometimes they didn't work hard, sometimes they had institutional privilege. But I also think that even if they didn't have institutional privilege, you are still on an arbitrary basis assigning them higher moral worth. Why is this important? It's important because the imperative is that people who are in poverty then internalize their failure as a reflection of their moral worth. Internalize the fact that they did not become rich, that they did not succeed as a marker, that they somehow deviate from the norm of what is good and the norm of what is acceptable. I think that that is really bad because I think the American dream is about externalization of success. It's not about you being fulfilled as a person. It's not about you internalizing your success at all. It's about how that success is projected and how you project it to the outside world. Okay. Why is this damaging? So even if the rich work really hard, I think that like the American dream fundamentally is like a system of justifying the rich's hold on power. So recognize that people who succeed within the framework of the American dream have no incentive to change the structures that made the American dream exclusionary to other people, have no incentive to do the kinds of redistribution that we would really like to see outside opposition, because they can justify their position not only through them having worked harder, but through them having deserved their success because of that. So I don't think that you see a tendency towards redistribution that we would like. I think that that is exceptionally problematic. If you don't buy like the kind of sympathetic view that I have for the rich people, you still should buy the view that we don't get a system of equal opportunity when we have the American dream, because people at the top don't have an interest in that, the massive redistribution that is required for that kind of equality of opportunity. So I think when side opposition tells you that this is a way to assert, or side government tells you that this is a way to assert injustice, I don't think that's true. We can have a doctrine of equality that is based on a premise of moral equality, and that being the justification for giving people access to things like education. I think that the justification that you get out of the American dream is something that is inherently capitalist and inherently ends-based, and that is something that Julie and I profoundly do not stand for. For these reasons, we oppose. Thank you.
First of all, just to contextualize a little bit about what the American dream's actual Americans. In America, we don't really like the rich, right? People that are rich we're highly critical of people that we consider old money. We're highly critical of the circumstances in which they achieve that money, and we question whether or not they actually earn that money. This is absolutely systemic in the United States of America. Who are real American heroes? People who I identify, who have come out of adverse circumstances, who have worked their hardest and are not millionaires, but people that are small business owners, people that own their property, people that are self-sufficient. This is the real level of an American hero, and I think it's actually relatively somewhat of a more achievable goal than being a millionaire. It's like completely a caricature of America that we all want to be rock stars and billionaires, and I don't think that's really what the American dream tells us. The American dream tells us that you can own a home, you can provide for your family, you can be self-sufficient, and this is a level of economic success that we're talking about. Not like insane, like eye-body type of thing that we're talking about. I don't think we necessarily fetishize the rich. And I still think we're incredibly class conscious in the United States, which is what John's extension talked to you about, which is not really addressed by the last speaker. But going on to their extension before I deal with the actual part around which what the American dream is, let's talk about capitalism, right? They say massive redistribution. I say that there's probably actually a pretty thriving debate with regard to whether or not we're going to be capitalist or communist. But I think the American dream is a much more nuanced argument for the types of good capitalism that we're talking about. But even if that were not the debate, and I don't think it is, like they just need to take into account the historical circumstances in which the state of the United States of America came about, right? The historical circumstances where we were going to be capitalist, because we were actually started out as colonies of a significant and vast capitalistic empire, right? Other circumstances that can prevent massive redistribution, economies, right? Economies of scale, massive capital discrepancies, the factors that she talks about, which are intrinsic talent and things like luck. I think the capitalist systems with free markets are fundamentally more inclusionary at the point where they still allow for a floor of people having equal opportunity, which is what we think is much better on our side of the house, because they still allow for free markets and things like innovation, which is what opening government talks to you about. I think that if they were going to mount a significant capitalist critique, they couldn't just point to the fact that there are people in adverse circumstances in capitalism, because there are people in adverse circumstances all around the world. What I think that the American dream gives them is a way to self-empower themselves based upon an identity characteristic that is completely divorced from who they are or their circumstances. It is merely about how hard they can work and what their effort is. And I think that people, in terms of their success or failure evaluation, in terms of their moral worth, are not evaluated based upon the outcomes. Like, Americans don't look at someone and say, how much money is in your bank account? This is how much worth you have. Look at how hard did you work in the circumstances that you were in, and we evaluate them based upon that. Like, I think this is just absolutely true. Like, look at how many successful immigrant narratives that we have in the United States of America. Immigrant communities can come from very many different places, and largely they can be unemployed, but they can be seen as successful because they carved out their own section of the American dream. They have their own property and are self-sufficient. This is the real type of success that we're talking about. I don't think we devalue morally the poor in the United States. I just think that's absolutely false. I think that you can point to significant amount of guilt that Americans have if they're incredibly wealthy or if they inherit, right? And compare that to the types of things or the types of ways that old money and classism are actually protected in other places around the world that Jonathan told you about, like looking to like and stuff like that. So what is the American dream, right? I think the American dream is a national point of inspiration that's universal because it's based upon your effort and your work, not your race, not your culture, not your gender. And I think this is actually good. I think it's easily digestible, it's quick, but it contains a significant nuance of argumentation that is class conscious, that is in and of itself critical of government and critical of the circumstances and the opportunities that the government and class societies give to people. And this, because of this, it allows people to self-empower and actually criticize their governments and the circumstances in which they are born via activism, right? Look to the example that John gives you about the feminist movement and things like Rosie River, where they think that there was significant benefit to this particular movement because of self-empowerment and because of hard work, which I do think is actually accessible to anybody. I don't think that actual economic success is accessible to anybody, but I do think that everybody can work hard in their circumstances. It's something that is absolutely universal.
Even if there are pockets in America that are suspicious of wealthier classes and class conscious, the American dream stops politicians from being able to stand up and be as persuasive as they could be and gain the critical mass they need to get policies passed through the US legislature that can actually lead to changes on the ground for those people.
So first of all, I think that if you're going to assume that all non-capitalist policies are the best, you need to do a lot more for that particular thing. Second of all, I think that people have individual rights. We should not internalize and think that they're not. They can't be conscious of all these different factors. I think that the American consciousness of the political circumstances is actually far more complex than we think, largely because the opposition bent has been basing their argumentation off caricatures. But secondly, let's look at the political outcomes and the types of politicians that are actually elected. They say these politicians are lying. I say Romney lost the election when he said some pretty offensive things about the welfare state instantly. That election was over the second that particular soundbite actually came about. And I think that this type of class consciousness that actually empowers Americans into questioning their government and questioning the types of things that we're talking about. So, let's say if it is false. So first of all, I think that the type of success that I talked to you about and that John talked to you about means that it is not false in a lot of circumstances, and people can achieve some level of economic success. But secondly, if it is false, I think that people can recognize the particular dissonance between the circumstances that they're talking about and demand equality of opportunity, which is why we look for broad-based justifications of things like the welfare state. Let's look at the alternative that John talked to you about. He talked to you about Angela Merkel's minaret banning because people are always going to look for certain types of justifications for the adverse circumstances that they are in. I think a much better justification for the adverse circumstance that you're in is not like I am in an adverse circumstance, therefore I have no power. It literally strips away the power from the individual. But the American dream empowers the particular individual by saying that you could, you can, number one, question the adverse circumstances which you're in because they are unjust fundamentally. And secondly, do you have individual power with which you challenge these particular things and you can pull yourself out? It not only demands awareness of the circumstances that we're talking about, and this awareness is regardless of particular identity. So what have we told you? We think that the American dream is something that can actually, number one, be successful in America, but this round needs to be evaluated in the historical context by which America has actually come about. I think the historical context is not one which we would not have had a capitalist structure. I think capitalist structures are always going to be endemic on some level to the certain types of states that we're talking about here. And I think the capitalist structures on some level can be good as long as they include some level of equality of opportunity. The American dream ensures that we are continuously conscious of equal opportunities and circumstances that prevent people from accessing some level of economic success, which means that not only we can be critical of these things, but it can unify people based upon factors of their identity that are not inherent to their particular identity, which allows empowerment on a multiplicity of different levels. So for all these reasons, we are very, very proud to propose.
And thank you very much for that, Josh. And I invite the officers to go to your floors and close out their bench and lead.
Madam Speaker, the American dream is not a rhetoric of equality, it is a rhetoric of exceptionalism and therefore a rhetoric of exclusivity. Holly and I think that the free market, even when it functions well, even in a world where it was not plagued by the kind of structural problems that opening opposition talked to you about so compellingly, and Holly talked to you about as well, is not a mechanism for equality. It rewards advantage, both structural and intrinsic or personal. It is unfair if you are successful, both because you face, or if you are more successful, both because you didn't have to face systematic racism, or because you were born better at math, or less inclined to personal failures, like, I don't know, depression, that would make you less motivated to work hard, that you would have to engage in on their side of the house. It is incredibly problematic that we only reward one sort of person under this framework, even if this framework functioned perfectly, which I think is very obvious it does not. It is not a rhetoric of equality, it does not ever lead to equality, the kind of social progress that Holly and I would stand for on our side of the house. Not everyone can fulfill the criteria for earning their success, even in a system in which this was possible. I think this is very patriarchal in a capitalist way that's problematic. I think owning a home and providing for your family are ideals that Holly and I do not necessarily stand for, or not necessarily inflict on all members of society. I think the American dream restricts the criteria of success in a way that is very harmful to people's personal aspiration and personal fulfillment. Not yet. My first theme is the conflation of value and success. So this places, we heard out of closing opposition, that this places an intrinsic value on people who work hard, and that's why we might get some allowance of things like immigration. Here is the problem. If this is indeed both a normative and a descriptive thing, as we heard outside opening government, we must believe by definition that it already exists to some extent. This system by which people can profit off of their own whatever exists to some extent. So success becomes the only observable measure of the intrinsic characteristics which they would like to encourage. The only way that you can see whether or not someone has fulfilled the criteria that would allow them to succeed in the American dream, or whether or not they have succeeded. This is definitely self-perpetuating to people who are already successful, and it does stifle conversation about things that we should do to the system to change it. The problem with this is that it attaches a moral value to socio-economic success, because that becomes a reflection of some intrinsic ability to work hard or intelligence or whatever they believe in inside government. So the problem with this is it attaches a moral value to socio-economic success. This leads to ideas like the rich really are better and do deserve either their talents or their privileges, and leads to the fetishization of the rich, which contributes to all of the structural problems that we heard outside opening opposition. I think that is incredibly problematic, but I think there is a deeper reason. First, I guess I'll take it away.
Does welfare reform show that the American dream can also be used to check against government-created poverty practices?
I don't think so, because I don't think that that is the only thing that we need to do to reform the system. The fact that that in itself is not sufficient to create the kind of society that Holly and I would like to stand for speaks for itself. I would like to talk to you, though, about the personal effects. Even if you have perfect welfare reform on their side of the house, we still think this leads to people being fundamentally less happy and less able to be self-fulfilled. Capitalism is not the only or even the best framework we can talk about, but like whatever. So the problem is, hard work does not pay off for everyone. If they recognize to any extent on their side of the house that there are these structural inequalities, then some people can work hard for 60 years of their life and never be able to engage in other kinds of personal fulfillment because they are told that this is the most valuable thing that they can be doing, the thing that will lead to the most important kind of success, and never succeed. Recognizing that this kind of inequality exists. Hard work is therefore not the right kind of life for everyone to engage in. First of all, maybe you just don't like it. Maybe you just don't want to own your home. This is the only legitimate option for success that is now available to you, right? But I think this is especially problematic for people who do buy into this narrative and who do decide that this will be not only their social but their personal criteria for success, and who are then still not able to realize it. I think this leads to feelings of personal failure, to the conflation of your own failure with your failure to succeed within the system. I think that is very problematic, because the markers of success become external, become what you can buy, or whether or not you own your home or can provide for your family, as we heard inside closing government. But the drivers of success are seen as internal, and that's where the problem arises, because it internalizes failure. If you haven't succeeded within the system, it is your fault for not being hardworking or whatever enough, right? You failed because you weren't good enough in a moral sense, when this becomes the criteria for moral value. But it also leads to the kind of success that is not always meaningful for those who are able to achieve it. They strive for it, because I think sometimes people should be able to strive for things other than capitalist success, or not to strive at all, or not to strive in the same way that would devote all of their time to this particular metric of success. I think people should be able to live according to their own values and motivations. I think when you conflate moral value with capitalist success, you undercut people's ability to meaningfully do this. Sure, back at it.
Forces and history of capitalism predate the American dream. If the American dream never happened, what would have actually happened to it?
Here's the problem. The way Holly and I are not going to even if we have to be, the way that the American dream particularly relates to the capitalist system because it conflates personal success with economic or structural success. It attaches moral value to socioeconomic position. That is the problematic relationship. Perhaps we would prefer a world that was less capitalist, but if we have to live in a capitalist world, we prefer to live in Canada, where at least we don't fetishize them, or at least we don't assume that they are rich because they have displayed the kind of personal characteristics that we would like to encourage. I think that is the relationship that makes the American dream particularly problematic. Okay, my third point is the structural effects. So there are two subpoints under this, and the first is poor shaping. So the fact that the failure to be economically successful reflects some failure for personal success means that there is an idea that the rich have earned or morally earned their success. We think that then there is little incentive to change the system because the narrative is not only that you should be able to thrive on your own personal characteristics, but because there is this exceptionalism that is inherent in the American dream, as we heard in fact at a side closing government, it's that even if the system you're on board works against you, you should be successful enough to overcome it. That those people who we value the most are those people who worked even within a system that was biased against them and succeeded. That is simply not always possible and absolutely not possible for the majority of people. I think it does attach moral weight to this kind of exceptionalism. We think that is inherently exclusive. Holly and I would not only lionize the people who are lucky enough or happen to be born with the right kind of talent, or happen to be in the right place at the right time and to be able to be successful. We also think that the rest of the people who cannot function within the system should also have moral weight attached to their efforts, and we never get that on their side of the house. Second of all, I think it is in the interest of the people who are in the positions of power in their system to perpetuate their own legitimacy and to never change the system. People in power who profited off this American dream system and the myth of meritocracy derive their legitimacy from the narrative of the moral value of their own success. There is very little incentive for them to ever say, actually, I just happen to be lucky. But furthermore, they continue to profit off of this system. There is very little incentive for those who are rich to use the political clout that this assigns them to engage in things like massive redistribution. We think it is always unfair that even if the free market functions perfectly, only 5% of people can ever succeed. Well, yet I think that is the wrong criteria for success, that it externalizes it, but it internalizes failure. We are proud to